He's alive!
Hey everybody, welcome back to Bookenstein. Before we get started with our book today, I figure we start with, Peyton and I have a lot of different books, and so we give some stories about some of the books we have. I have here a copy of Romola. You can't even see the front of it. And basically, I was in a junk store one time at like this dirty old junk store in West Virginia, middle of nowhere. And I mean, you've got basically the guy buys a bunch of junk from estate sales. He didn't even know what he'd have. The stuff's lying everywhere. So I'm over near the cash registers, just flipping through old stuff. And I see this book, as somebody had tried to sell it. You might be able to see there. Somebody tried to sell it for $65 at one point.
Wow.
And so I'm like, man, I don't know what this is, but this might be worth something. And so I'm like, how much for this book? And the guy kind of looks at it, he's like, $1. So I was like, okay, so I bought this book for $1. And I did some research. I'm not like, I'm not certified to appraise books or anything, but I think it's a first American edition of Romola. And so it's by George Eliot, which is a British author, actually a woman, but used a pen name.
Yep.
And so that's pretty cool. I don't know how much it's worth, but it's worth more than $1, which is what I paid for it.
Yeah, that scrawling on the front actually looked like a British, whether it was like a shilling or whatever it was. That actually, yeah, what I can see actually looks like it's I can't see it that close. You have to send me a screenshot, but I think that's British money actually. But anyways, yeah, hey, what are we into today?
Well, if you can kind of see behind me, we're talking about Dune today.
Yeah, baby.
Which I was introduced to much more recently than you. I saw the new movie was coming out, and I was like, I'd never read any of the books. So I read one in preparation for the movie. I've read about 8 of them since then, a couple of board games. So when were you introduced to Dune?
Well, I grew up, my stepdad was a huge fan. So he actually has one of the new Chris knives that he got for Christmas. I got him the Dune mug, the House of Atreides Dune mug that you can get from Bud K. But he grew up reading those. I remember him sitting there. He had read them and reread them. And then when I wrote Church Plantology, I was very much, I had like cabin fever because I was writing that book 16, 17, 18 hours a day, sleeping, getting up, hitting the writing desk again. And I had a Barnes and Noble copy of that for $20. And I kept seeing it on the shelf thinking, because I would daydream, oh man, if only I could read fiction. I had to just immerse myself in church planting. And it got boring, actually. I like to keep a nice, well-balanced diet of my reading. I'm omnivorous. I like to read a little bit of everything all at one time. And I started to long for fiction. And that was a bucket list book. I was never interested in reading it, but suddenly by being confined and cut off from everything else, I got super, I just longed to read Dune. I know that sounds weird. I had heard somebody tell me he is the Tolkien of the sci-fi world.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, I got to read it. And people are like, dude, you haven't read that? It's like if you read someone, or if you talk to someone who reads fantasy and they tell you they've never read Tolkien, you'd be like, what? So anyways, I read it.
Nice.
It was the first book I read when I got off the out of textbook writing jail.
Yeah. So if you haven't read it, it's basically, which we're going to probably have lots of spoilers, but if you haven't read it, you've had plenty of time to read it by now.
And you had a movie part 1, so you better listen to half this podcast.
That's right. Although I think the book's probably better than the movie.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so let's just get straight into that. What did you think of the book overall? Let's give an overview of what you thought.
Yeah, to me, there's a lot of things that are really interesting that are different than a lot of other sci-fi books. Like one of the things is it's timelessness, right? Because most sci-fi books or even TV shows or whatever, they're trying to have all these flashy new stuff. And what makes Dune timeless is it's really focused on, it's got kind of an old world vibe, right? Like it's set in a world where like robots and AI are illegal. And so they're relying heavily on human brains and a lot of, they strip away a lot of the technology, relying on the environment and on their own wits.
Yeah. To me, it was a masterpiece of writing. I could see why people called him the Tolkien of sci-fi simply because of his world building.
Mhm.
When you watch the movies are very slow and I would say emotive. They're atmospheric because that's how he writes, which is very much like Tolkien. You get a sense of the world, like you feel like you're on Dune. And it, to me, the other thing about Frank Herbert was that I was surprised. I didn't know anything about it going into it, except I had seen the 80s movie, but I heard, oh, it's nothing like the book, which was fair. But he writes a bit like Herman Melville, where he'll do all of this kind of like Herman Melville tells you the story, and then he weaves in, oh, this is what the whaling industry, this is what it looks like to harpoon, and then to render its blubber down into usable product and oil. And, and he goes very technical. Frank Herbert kept doing this. He kept going into this technical, but it was beautifully written. How did this culture adapt to this desert planet? And you're actually reading it thinking, could this science actually work? And it's a book that really is kind of a Trojan horse for environmentalism. And that was really interesting. So there's a lot of themes, like you said, about outlawing AI, also being environmentally friendly. I was reading a book recently where they talked about the Neolithics. When you live in a harsh environment, you can't see nature as it and me, or nature and us. You have to see yourself as a part of nature. And that's exactly what that race of people does in there, is they see themselves as a part of the ecosystem. What part do we play in the ecosystem? Which, when you're at the top of the food chain and you're the dominant factor in the ecosystem, you don't have to do it. You have a luxury that says, I can just dominate this ecosystem and not be a part of it. But when you're in survival mode, which is where these, and Frank Herbert really kind of contrasts that to people at the top of the food chain,
Yeah.
and the people that have to subsist. They're in a subsistence economy, and they've got to become one with the environment. That has implications I want to get back to, but that was my take.
No, that's really good. I mean, you on one side you have the Harkonnens, who are like, they're the epitome of greed and industry. They don't care about anyone or anything. And then you have the Fremen people, who, like, they're harnessing the harshness of the environment for which actually produces the most valuable substance in the world, like the spice. And and I guess not the world, the universe.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some cool little twists and turns in the story too. Some revelations that come out that are really exciting. You're like, whoa, that's amazing. Which then makes you wonder, does that kind of thing exist in our environment? I would say in our modern day, we are uncovering revelations like, oh, like, even like I read Deuteronomy, right? Because I work for Through the Word. When I go through Deuteronomy, there's all this environmental stuff in Deuteronomy where God says, hey, don't chop down trees. When you go into a nation and you're going to war, don't chop down all the trees, because, hey, trees aren't men, like, leave them alone. Or if you harvest, a bird's eggs, don't kill the bird as well. Like, there's this idea of you've got to take care and steward the earth, which we don't hear often. But God, remember, Deuteronomy is a sermon, the series of 3 sermons God gives Moses before they enter the promised land. And he's telling him, like, hey, I made nature, be kind to it. Like this, you got to take care, you got to steward this land I'm giving you. And it seems really dumb for God to have to talk about how we treat birds and birds' nests, but that's because we're dumb and we don't get that stuff. And that was amazing. So I really enjoyed that, and I think today, so much of our sci-fi is based on Dune. Like, I didn't realize until I read Dune how much George Lucas, sorry, George, how much he ripped off Frank Herbert.
Yeah,
I
Desert
didn't realize
Planet.
that. I didn't realize that. So a lot of our culture and a lot of our pop culture and stuff that's just permeated our is taken from that,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. One of the things I've also found really interesting is the role that religion and power play throughout in his universe, because you have this kind of um, the people in power are trying to manipulate religion for their own ends, right? And
Yes.
you see, and there's, I mean, it's not just Frank Herbert that identifies this. I mean, you have like Karl Marx talks about religion being the opium of the people.
Yep.
That people are so focused on the future that as long as you can control that narrative of having them focused on the afterlife, they don't care what you do to them in the meantime. I was reading actually last night um, a book called, I think it's called This Here Flesh. It's by Cole Arthur Riley. And she was talking about when someone was sharing the gospel to her for like the first time, they kept talking about salvation. And that's all they would talk about. That's all that a lot of people talk about in apologetics. And she's like, I just didn't care. I
Right.
didn't, if Jesus didn't want to have something to do with my present, I didn't care about what happens when I die.
I remember we went church planting in New Zealand years ago, and we started off, and it was the most frustrating place to do evangelism ever because we called it Happy Town. There's not been any major catastrophe hit the people of, New Zealand, the Westerners there. There'd not been any major war on there. Like, it was happening. The Maoris were another story, but for the Westerners, Western culture to live there, it was Happy Town. We're like, we got no bad news. Why do we need good news? Like, we're happy. Life is great. But one of the other things that really hit me was in the book, and it goes to this, it kind of connects what you said about religion and like Nietzsche's quote, opium of the masses, and even the frickin' the idea of becoming one with your environment. It made me think of church planning a little bit, that, we often will see culture as them and us, much like the Harkonnens see the environment. Like, this is something to be used for our ends. We can look at a community or culture when we go into it as, hey, I am the church planner. I bring the kingdom. You're the kingdom of darkness. I'm going to come in here and it's them and us. And if you don't become one of them, and that's what Paul Atreides does in the book, he becomes a Fremen. He actually becomes one of them. And if you think about the greatest missionary that ever lived, Jesus, right? He becomes one of us. That is the incarnation, his incarnational presence. Now, the interesting thing is that Paul Atreides is the Messiah.
Yeah.
He is the Messiah figure for this desert planet. It's all been prophesied, yada, yada. And so he goes in there. He doesn't know that this is true about him. All these prophecies are there, but that incarnational theology, that trope is there, and he becomes a part. But I think we can learn a lot as Christians when we're talking about missional incarnation. We can learn a lot from the approach there, where he embraces the people and their ways to reach them and to lead them. And it's very much not like the Harkonnens, who, again, they come in saying, we're going to dominate you. We see you as less than us. We have to be careful of that in mission.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's to Frank Herbert's credit that he's got these people trying to play power politics with religion, but it gets away from them. They never have control over it. And it's interesting, we talk about the Fremen and Paul Atreides, who a lot of times is referred to Muad'Dib during the novel. And I think it's super interesting. You really don't see it very often where someone's appropriating, and like, I think it's a more honoring way, like Middle Eastern culture and Islam. You see a lot of people in any other literature are really disparaging towards that. I even did, like, one time, so I was working on my master's degree, and I did like a historiography of the Barbary Wars. And you could just trace all throughout history, whatever war was going on, they saw the Barbary Wars in terms of that. So they used to talk about that, about piracy during World War One, when you had unrestricted submarine warfare with the Germans. They talked about the Barbary Wars as kind of a legal problem with unrestricted. And so then you go all the way to after 9/11, they start talking about the Barbary Wars as a form of terrorism. And it's always got this negative slant towards Islamic culture. And that's like throughout American history, we see that. But we don't see that in Frank Herbert's novel.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Well, hopefully you guys will read it, because it is a classic. It is the book, I think, in the sci-fi. Other people might differ with me. Someone might say Starship Troopers. Someone might say, Stranger in a Strange Land. But I think Dune is the quintessential sci-fi novel that should be on everyone's bucket list. I think it is the chief of I think it's the Lord of the Rings book, to the equivalent in the sci-fi world. But I also think there's a lot that you can learn about a clash of cultures. And for us as cross-cultural missionaries or people that are concerned with incarnational ministry, I think you'll learn a lot from it. And hopefully this is how you read books. I read a quote years ago that Tozer used to read Shakespeare on his knees, and he used to ask God, enlighten me. This is the most, famous literature on the planet outside of the Bible. God, enlighten me about why. What is it that's connecting with human beings? Much like Solomon looking at the wisdom hidden in the universe. Hopefully you'll pick stuff out that's different than from what even Brooks and I have found.
I think the other thing that's really interesting about Dune is that you have this theme of strong female characters, which I think is based a lot on Frank's wife, Beverly. He bounced all of his ideas off of her. She edited the book. And so he bases a lot of his strong female characters off of her strength, because she actually gave up her own writing career so that she could support him and while he wasn't making a whole lot of money writing things like Dune. And so you have the Bene Gesserit group that is kind of running a lot of the universe behind the scenes, and just a lot of strong female characters that you don't see a lot in other literature, I think.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And I think even with the Bible, right? I mean, people miss that in the Bible too, where Paul in Romans 16, where he's talking about his fellow workers and the people to be greeted that are, kind of the ballers in Rome. 1/3 of them are women. And that's how life works, whether you want to give attention to it or not. Paul definitely calls it out, gives attention to it in Romans 16. And Frank Herbert definitely does as well, whether you call it out or not. Women are, they're more a force to be reckoned with. When I was in Wales and Welsh society, Wales was a matriarchal society. And the reason for that was that men went down in the mines and died. And so a lot of the copper works, the mining communities, men didn't live long. And so women became the mucilage of society. They were the backbone. They're what held everything together. So Wales was actually matriarchal in a strange way. You had very, very tough men there, but it was still very matriarchal. And I think we underestimate women. Viking society, the same. The women were warriors because the men died frequently. They had to be. So, and again, you would expect that, right? In a harsh environment like that, that he writes about, women are every bit the warriors that men are. They have to overcome the elements and hardships and savagery. So it's good. And on mission work, you learn in church plants, mission work, women are every bit as valuable as men. It's when we get sequestered behind church walls and we stop going on mission that we think it's a man's world. And that's unfortunate. So, well, anyways, guys, thanks for joining us for another episode and edition of Bookenstein Sci-Fi Edition today. Dune's been our book. Brooks Hammond has been my co-host, much more knowledgeable. I mean, you dropped some things. I didn't even know what those Barbary Wars were. I'm going to have to look into that. So once again, I have been out-read and out-intellected. So brother, that was fun. And hopefully you guys enjoy, and we'll see you next time on Bookenstein.